Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here, and today we'll be discussing 7 historical myths modern people believe about medieval people, along with the actual historical reality. Remember to like and leave a comment below if you want to see more videos on historical myths. A popular caricature of the Middle Ages is that, in essence, nobody bathed. From the lowest serf to the kings and emperors, so the story goes, everyone flat out stank. This myth likely arose from later eras misinterpreting instances where public baths were closed due to plague or moral fears in the late medieval or early modern period. Further, the spread of this myth owes much to the Dark Ages stereotype. Renaissance and Enlightenment writers cast medieval Europeans as ignorant and dirty compared to Romans before them or modern people after. The reality is that medieval men and women did bathe and valued cleanliness. Ample evidence from the period, including literature, medical texts, and archaeology, shows that people washed regularly. Public bathhouses were common in medieval towns and cities. For example, 13th century Paris had at least 32 public bathhouses in operation. Further, soap making was an established trade, as proven by soap makers' guilds existing, and the wealthy even had rudimentary personal indoor baths. Bathing was seen as a normal part of life and important for health. That said, the closure of public baths during and after the plague caused a significant reduction in the cleanliness of city dwellers for generations to come. In short, medieval folks didn't live in unwashed squalor their whole lives, and routine bathing and personal hygiene were very much a part of medieval society. In fact, certain regions in the medieval world were known for their high-quality spring water in which to take baths. It's commonly said that educated people in the Middle Ages thought the earth was flat, but this is just straight up false. The most common recitation of this false narrative is the belief that Christopher Columbus and his benefactors thought that he may fall off the edge of the flat earth. Educated Europeans in medieval times knew the earth was spherical. Since antiquity, a round earth was understood, and medieval scholars continued to teach and accept this fact. Virtually every learned Christian scholar acknowledged the earth as a sphere, and even had estimates of its circumference. The Columbus story was really about the size of the earth, not its shape. His contemporaries agreed the world was round, but believed his westward route to Asia was too long to be practical. And of course, interestingly, his proposed route to Asia was indeed too long to be practical, with the technology as it existed at the time. Of course, Columbus's contemporaries had no knowledge of the Americas, and had the Atlantic Ocean truly been a vast, empty expanse, he would have been in serious trouble, to say the least. In short, the flat earth belief in the Middle Ages, at least amongst educated medieval people, is a modern myth, not a medieval reality. That's not to say that there wasn't a belief in a flat earth, but rather that scientifically minded individuals had known since antiquity that this wasn't the case. According to legend, Crusader knights locked their wives into iron chastity belts to ensure their fidelity. The wives would give their husbands the key, intended to be used for an unsealing ceremony upon the Crusaders' return from the Holy Land. This sensational story gained traction in later centuries. The image of the chastity belt was often a satirical or moral allegory in Renaissance art, not a real medieval practice. Even in the 1500s, the concept was treated as a joke, implying people at the time didn't take it seriously. By the Victorian era, unscrupulous museum curators created fake medieval chastity belts to display, which further spread the myth. There is no evidence that chastity belts were used in medieval Europe. Historians have found no medieval records of actual women made to wear such devices, and no physical belts reliably dated to the Middle Ages. In fact, any supposed medieval chastity belts in museums have been debunked as later fabrications. Interestingly, there's some evidence to suggest they may have been used by the nobility in certain areas in the 16th and 17th centuries. However, these usages, if historical, were extremely limited and not the widespread medieval contraption they are often believed to be. Many assume the Middle Ages were rife with elaborate torture instruments, with the infamous Iron Maiden often cited as a quintessential medieval torture device. Exhibits in some museums and lurid Victorian writings portrayed dungeons filled with devices like these. This created a lasting impression that these were widely used by cruel medieval inquisitors. The historical reality is that the Iron Maiden is essentially a myth, and there is no record of such a device being used in medieval times. Historians have determined that the first mentions and physical examples of Iron Maidens appear in the late 1700s, not the 1400s. They were assembled not for actual use in torture, but to sell tickets to so-called museums. Despite this, the myth of the Iron Maiden as a common medieval torture device continues on to the present day. Now, this isn't to say that medieval torture and execution methods weren't extremely brutal. For instance, being hanged, drawn, and quartered, a practice which began during the 13th century, makes the Iron Maiden look like a walk in the park. Breaking on the wheel, also practiced in medieval Europe, again makes the Iron Maiden look like an easy way to go out in comparison. The Prima Noctis myth claims that medieval lords had the legal right to sleep with a peasant bride on her wedding night. It's a pervasive tale in popular culture, featured in movies like Braveheart, that paints medieval nobles as exercising this outrageous privilege. The origin of this myth isn't in actual medieval law, but in later speculation and propaganda. It became especially popular in 18th and 19th century writings, where people claimed such a custom had existed in the distant feudal past. This was often done as a way to illustrate the oppression of peasants or the lustful nature of nobles. There is no historical evidence that Prima Noctis was ever an actual law or widespread practice in medieval Europe. Medieval legal records, church documents, and chronicles do not document any lord routinely invoking this supposed right. In fact, when the issue appears in historical discussion, it's often much later authors saying, "It used to happen in the old days," which is essentially hearsay, not proof. Of course, none of this is to say that this wasn't a disturbing practice exercised by certain nobles in certain places at certain times. Notably, a 15th century law from Aragon, in present-day Spain, explicitly forbade lords from engaging with new brides in this way. That said, it listed this act among other offenses that were already illegal, immoral, and widely condemned. According to mainstream historians, this suggests it was condemning an exceptionally heinous act, not codifying against a normal custom. However, some have suggested that this does provide evidence that the practice was widely engaged in, at least in one region of Europe, at one time. The image of a Viking wearing a horned helmet into combat is iconic in modern media. It appears in cartoons, logos, like the NFL team helmet, and even in operatic depictions. Because of this ubiquitous representation, many people assume Norse warriors during the medieval period wore helmets adorned with horns or wings. However, this is not historically accurate, even in the slightest. No archaeological find of a Viking Age helmet has ever included horns. Vikings did not wear horned helmets in battle, as doing so would have been impractical. Horns would get in the way, or could be used to yank the helmet off in combat. Rather, Viking warriors wore helmets that were virtually indistinguishable from those worn by their close cultural cousins, such as the Anglo-Saxons. Notably, some contemporary Norse art does depict Norse people wearing what appear to be horned helmets. However, these depictions are of ceremonies or deities, rather than actual depictions of real combat scenes. The romanticized image of the medieval knight as a paragon of virtue, gallantry, and unwavering honor is deeply embedded in modern popular culture. From the tales of King Arthur's Round Table to cinematic portrayals in modern films and television, the idea persists that every knight had to adhere strictly to a lofty code of chivalry. This code included defending the helpless and acting with impeccable morality. However, while these ideals were indeed extolled in literature and courtly society, the historical reality was considerably more nuanced. The myth was fueled by medieval and Renaissance writers who celebrated chivalry as a moral beacon for society. Courtly romances and epic poems, composed for the nobility, often depicted knights as heroic and magnanimous. These literary works, designed to inspire and educate, inevitably glossed over the harsher realities of feudal life. Over centuries, this idealized narrative was cemented by later reinterpretations and adaptations in art, literature, and film, which favored an image of knights as uniformly virtuous. In practice, medieval knighthood was much more a social and military institution than anything approaching an ethical one. While many late medieval knights did aspire to chivalric ideals, knighthood was defined by feudal obligations, territorial ambitions, and personal profit. Numerous knights engaged in brutal warfare, committed acts of plunder against the weak, or participated in political intrigues where the pursuit of honor simply wasn't at play. The chivalric code, to the extent it really even existed, wasn't ever enforced, and deviations from its principles were common.